Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Fiji's 2030 Sustainable Development Roadmap. There is a genuinely fascinating narrative unfolding here. We're looking at an upper-rung, middle-income country sitting at a true crossroads, trying to balance struggling legacy systems with a very pressing need to modernize. We're going to structure this explainer around 5 key areas: growth versus true well-being, traditional industries under pressure, culture and micro-enterprises, transitioning to digital economies, and finally, building resilient green futures. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, growth versus true well-being. To really evaluate Fiji's development, we've got to fundamentally change how we measure socioeconomic progress. For decades, the focus has been heavily skewed towards simple output, but as you'll see, that doesn't always translate to a better life for the people on the ground.
Think about this quote for a second. The irony of digging and filling the same hole as adding to GDP, but does not contribute to society. It brilliantly illustrates exactly why relying solely on gross domestic product is, well, a pretty poor indicator of genuine societal advancement.
So what does this all mean? It's about understanding the core difference between economic growth, which is just the raw math of increasing national output, and actual economic development. Development is the human element. It's the overall improvement in the everyday standard of living, education, and health. It's the shift towards a holistic well-being economy, rather than just bigger numbers on a spreadsheet.
As any Year 12 economics revision session will highlight, tools like the Human Development Index, or HDI, are much better at measuring a country's true socioeconomic health. By factoring in life expectancy and education alongside income, the HDI places Fiji in a solid medium to high tier. It tells us a much richer story than just looking at the financial ledger.
Moving on to Section 2, traditional industries under pressure. Let's see how this builds into the realities facing Fiji's traditional economic backbones. If development is truly about the standard of living, we have to objectively examine the industries that historically provided that living.
Now, what's really interesting here is how clearly we can map out the dual front pressures squeezing these legacy sectors. It's coming from everywhere. The sugar industry, for example, is getting hit externally by things like Brexit and the end of WTO subsidies. But internally, they're dealing with aging farmers and massive mill breakdowns. Fisheries are in the exact same boat. They're losing ground to distant water fishing nations globally, while battling outdated cannery machinery and power outages at home.
200,000. Let that sink in. That is the staggering number of people depending on an essentially insolvent sugar industry, making a meager $3,000 annually. When you put it into that perspective, it becomes painfully obvious why younger generations are migrating away. It's simply no longer economically viable for them.
Putting on our policy advisor hats for a moment, it's critically clear that expecting these struggling legacy industries to magically resolve trade deficits or secure future food supplies without massive reform is entirely unrealistic. Pouring more state funds into old machinery just isn't the answer. These sectors require profound structural reform and value-adding diversification to survive.
Okay, Section 3, culture and grassroots micro-enterprises. If those legacy industries are faltering, we really need to look at how traditional cultural industries can thrive alongside modern economic development.
And the impact here is absolutely crucial. Cultural economics prove that grassroots activities are incredibly vital because they blend the preservation of heritage with very real, modern income generation, especially for rural women and youth. Activities like masi making, weaving, and carving aren't just cultural artifacts, they're dynamic economic drivers. Plus, they're heavily influenced by the kara-kere system, which deeply strengthens national identity and social bonds.
To actually support this growth, the government took steps to boost micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs. The established rural centers, provided market tents for vendors, and introduced mobile banking. It's a clear, targeted push to empower rural demographics and encourage savings, which is essential given that women are outliving men and need sustainable livelihood options.
But, and this is a major red flag, there is a critical gap here. The abysmal absence of visible monitoring and evaluation for state MSME grants puts taxpayer fiscal resources at severe risk. Evaluating this objectively, throwing money at a problem without tracking the outcomes means we can't ensure these vital safety nets are actually working. Without strict monitoring, these grants risk failing the very micro-enterprises they intend to support.
Right, on to Section 4, transitioning to digital economies. So how exactly does Fiji pivot to a truly modern framework?
If traditional agriculture is shrinking, where is the growth?
With traditional agriculture unable to fully support the next generation, we have to ask, what sectors can harness Fiji's greatest asset, its human capital? The nation has a motivated, highly educated youth population. How do we transition this workforce and put them to work effectively?
Well, the answer lies in the digital revolution. Engaging in global business services is a far better option than solely relying on agriculture to be the country's growth engine. Think about it. Over 80% of Fortune 500 companies outsource these services. Fiji, with its relatively lower labor costs combined with a high skill base, is perfectly positioned to capture a slice of this global IT, data science, and AI market.
However, if we're critiquing the current landscape, the state absolutely cannot do this alone. Robust public-private partnerships are desperately needed to formalize this human capital drive. The government has to collaborate with private tech and data sectors to build the right training pipelines and digital infrastructure to capture those global outsourced services.
And finally, Section 5, building resilient green futures. Because let's be honest, none of this economic development matters if the land itself is not protected from climate change.
This chart brilliantly illustrates where green climate funding must be directed to build vital resilience. We're talking about coastal and river protection to prevent salination, upgrading transport infrastructure, and expanding alternative energy. These aren't just environmental nice-to-haves. They are absolute foundational necessities for uninterrupted economic activity against catastrophic weather.
And there's huge momentum here. The Fiji Development Bank is actively building capacity to access international green climate funds. By securing these global funds, green investments don't just protect the environment, they actually act as massive catalysts for sustainable economic growth and social inclusion. What we're seeing is a total paradigm shift. Fiji is moving from a reactive environmental policy, being a vulnerable victim of industrialized pollution, to taking proactive climate leadership on the global stage. Instead of just waiting around, they are accessing global funds and showcasing to the world exactly how capacity building and adaptation can be successfully executed.
A successful small island country that is leader in climate change and digital economy. I love this quote because it perfectly summarizes the ultimate goal of the 2030 Sustainable Development Roadmap. It boldly pairs the necessity of environmental survival with the massive, game-changing potential of a digitally fluent human capital base.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question. Can Fiji successfully pivot from its traditional dependencies to become a leading global model of digital economy and climate resilience? The roadmap is drawn, the potential is huge, but will the execution follow? It's going to demand rigorous monitoring, strategic partnerships, and a total shift in how we measure success. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the data.